So we are here today to talk about how AI is changing the threat landscape, specifically as it relates to eSkimming. That's kind of the focal point that we have here at Source Defense. Um, in full disclosure, I am not an AI. I'm a real human being, but I don't know how much longer that'll actually be the case. Not in my world. I guess more to say, I don't know how much longer until we have like actually AI-driven presentations. But we did lean on AI for this presentation. So, full disclosure there, we're using AI to train you guys and teach you guys about AI. And that seems to be the world we're headed toward. This is also a conversation around the need for advanced behavioral-based solutions, specifically in eSkimming security, and I'll point to why as we get into the session here. I wanted to give a little quick background on who Source Defense is. I realize not probably everybody on this call knows us, so I'll run through that real quick. We're really about protecting data at the point of capture. We're a web security company. We round out, pretty glaring hole in web security, focused on the client side, not the server side of the equation. We think we're an enabler. Our clients find that working with us, they can actually do more things than they were able to do previously. I'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. And, we're really in the third-party risk management game, and that'll become clear as we get into this, in addition to, other elements of the presentation. We're about data security, data privacy, and compliance, and it's PCI, which might be the framework that you're thinking of and operating on when you think about eSkimming. It's also GDPR and HIPAA and FFIEC that we touch. I'll talk a little bit about a couple of these tools. Probably won't have time to go into all of them, but we do offer a bunch of free tools to support your journey to better online commerce and safer web security. Probably the one that I'll jump into most detail will be the rapid action plan. But we can help you with scoping your projects, giving you guidance on the build versus procure process. We can educate your teams. We happily do that, with no cost, sort of free consultation from our experts. We can help you with a website assessment. We'll work with you and your auditors in the PCI realm. We do all that because we're a PCI PPO, a principal participating organization. And we really feel, a strong duty to the community. We are engaged, sort of across all aspects of the payments ecosystem, and happy to support you in your journey, regardless of where you might be. If you're a merchant, a payment service provider, an e-commerce platform provider, if you're a QSA, if PCI is not the deal and you're here for, broader questions around data privacy and HIPAA, we can help you with all of it. So that's a little background on us. We're here today to talk about this sort of like new world that we're sort of finding ourselves in. Sort of bonus points if anybody can tell me what that picture is of. But I'll give you 10 seconds before I just answer. That's HAL 9000. I think it's fitting as we get into the world of science fiction becoming science fact to sort of pull that in as a cultural reference. Today's agenda, AI agenda, because it was powered a little bit by AI. I want to talk to you with a quick primer on eSkimming. Sort of TLDR. It's all about JavaScript. We'll talk about that. We go through some real world case studies recently of some eSkimming attacks. It was a pretty wide reaching campaigns. And then we're going to get into the conversation around, what AI is doing, how the rise of AI tooling and malware is really changing the game, how it's really impacting the entire notion of a patch window. Talk a little bit about, sort of the commerce world. And I say commerce versus, retail, because, everybody, regardless of which industry, does some form of commerce online, and talk about eSkimming on fraud, and then get into a conversation around what needs to happen, why legacy controls such as CSP and SRI are going to miss every time. And, sort of give you a general sense for an understanding of what advanced behavioral-based eSkimming security really looks like. Okay. So quick primer on eSkimming. I'll kind of roll through, this timeline in a fairly, concise sort of fashion. But ultimately, what's happened in the world of data security and in the world of, security writ large, especially in PCI, is we've moved from the need to protect our data in transit as it's going across the network or, at rest in our databases, to also having to include a focus on protecting data at the point of input, as it's being captured, as it's being entered into the online forms that power commerce. And how do we get here? It's been a long, crazy road. probably about a 20-year road to get to this point. And I'll roll you through it, right? With the move, I'm specifically talking about card data at this point in time, PCI protected data, payments data. With the move to EMV, which, ostensibly took about 10 years to happen, from 2005 to 2015, you could arguably say it's still underway, because still a lot of merchants that are not EMV, fully. But with the move in that direction, card not present became the target. It's much harder to steal, card data in the traditional sense, at the sort of ground level, if you will. Card present becomes a real hard thing to monetize and to steal and to sort of copy and duplicate. Had to move to card not present, and almost like clockwork, like the year after or within months of the shift kind of happening in the U.S. We saw the dawn of what was called Mage Cart. Now it's referred to as eSkimming. Still hear some people refer to as Mage Cart, but basically the emergence of eSkimming, key logging, form scraping type attacks. These are attacks that are slow and low. You'll hear about a couple of these case studies where these things have gone on for quite some time, impacting an enormous amount of websites. What we see in the dawn to sort of the first emergence of high-profile attacks, and continue to see, is usually the attacks like fly under the radar for a couple of years. And as a result, once they're discovered, they're really impactful, very high profile, a lot of PII and PCI data, and increasingly PHI pilfered in the process. It's exactly what was seen with sort of the first sort of disclosures around these Mage card attacks. Major airline, major ticketing company, a couple of years before they discovered it, and as a result, million plus consumers impacted. What's interesting is that it sort of has a play both in terms of the damage to the actual breach victims and to the merchant and all of the cost of data breach. But we saw for the first time after one of those attacks how it also impacts other elements of data privacy compliance. A major GDPR fine was levied against that airline as a result of them not being good stewards of care of that data. And so the risk gets more pronounced in terms of financial impact to an organization, with that as an example. We saw a quantum lift in e-commerce starting in 2022 when the pandemic hit, and high profile breaches continued to this day. One of the interesting shifts that occurred sort of in that time frame, and it's still there today, and is evidenced through a lot of research that's out there, and these case studies I'll talk about, is in the early stages of these attacks, it was sort of targeted, going after major brands by name, isolating down and trying to attack their infrastructure. Increasingly, it's a spray and pray or a massive trolling kind of campaign that the adversaries use to hit as many sites as possible, as fast as possible. And increasingly, with some of the capabilities that AI is enabling, they're able to do so, very, very easily, and rapidly against, newly disclosed vulnerabilities. And I'll talk about that. In 2022, PCI basically said, and the card industry said, we got to do something about this. They introduced PCI DSS 4.0, basically put eSkimming controls, right in the crosshairs of things that you need to do to be compliant. They did so because fraud started to pick up significantly behind this attack vector, and is now a primary source of fraud, driven through these types of attacks. We had a couple of years until April 1st of this year, for the controls they outlined in PCI DSS 4.0.1 now, to be mandatory. Still a massive portion of the industry is not compliant, has not done something. Probably your organization is still considering, the approach and why and what, and we can help you with that as we go along. But something's got to be done, and I think some of the evidence that I'll present in this discussion will really hammer that home and maybe help you, sort of drive priority for your organization outside of the compliance conversation. So definitely, if any of this proves useful to conversations that you need to have internal, let us know, and we will help, get the information over to you as fast as possible and allow you to get out there and start educating. I think other signs, 2023, 100 million plus cards available online, the vast majority card not present, proves what's going on here. And the attack surface is increasing. And I'll talk about what the attack surface looks like. And this is the year, as I mentioned, we're supposed to be compliant. If you aren't compliant yet, you got to get compliant, but you really got to start focusing this on more as a security issue. How do these e-skimming attacks happen? As I mentioned, it's JavaScript, baby. That's what the attack vector is. That is where the bad guys are playing, and that is an area that we need to focus on in terms of driving controls and getting things in place pretty damn rapidly. You can't sort of have these attacks without sort of looking at JavaScript as the source. The reason for that is JavaScript basically performs any action and behaves in any way it wants on the modern website. And it's running on 97, maybe 99% at this point of all websites. And so it's everywhere. It's ubiquitously used. It's across your environment and every other environment. And it's got no native security controls. And, JavaScript has a lot of power when it's deployed. And the bad guys realize that, and they're taking advantage of that with these mage card or e-skimming or form jacking, credential harvesting types attacks. Part of the issue is that the modern website is comprised of services and code that really isn't under your control. I'd say what we have found is roughly 18% of the code that's deployed across 7,000 of the world's largest websites that we looked at last year as part of the Verizon Payment Security Report was actually first-party code. The other 82% was built and cobbled together through open source and through services like Google Analytics and for chat, for analytics, for multimedia, you name it. The chance is that you're pulling somebody in as a partner, part of your digital supply chain to help drive the web experience that you have. You have to have these people in there. The code is very powerful. The code is not managed. It's not controlled. There's no sort of, no one's watching the hen house, if you will. And so it's this glaring gap in third-party risk management that the bad guys are taking advantage of. I referenced polyfill.io here. This is an example I'm going to give, in a second, as a type of open source service that had been called in at the point, before the problem emerged by, a massive portion of the web. And that's something that, is fairly commonplace. The use of services, sort of across all websites. There's a commonality associated with them that allow the adversary, to operate in those spray and pray or those one-to-many types of attacks, like I mentioned. Why it's bad? There's a lot of capability that JavaScript has. It can do most of these things, and it does do most of these things inherently and natively based on design. And then when the bad guy, recognizes that that code is already there, already performing these functions, and they compromise it, it's very powerful for them. They can change page content. They can add content like text fields, video, form fields. They can redirect visitors to websites that are their own control. All bad things, all things that are happening natively, for the functions of those services. And I'll get into why that's a problem here in 1 second. But all things that bad guys, use, and that lowers their barrier of technical entry, as does AI. And we'll talk here, in a second about that reduction of that technical barrier of entry. But I wanted to mention this polyfill attack as an example. Little play on, Poly want to cracker, Poly want to hack you. Basically, massive supply chain hack happened in June of last year. It was a widely used service that was trusted and that was used for browser compatibility to help upgrade antiquated browsers to receive new website functionality. And so, as you might imagine, it had been trusted, had been in place for a long period of time. There were thousands upon thousands of websites, using the service. Roughly 4% of the entire web was using this polyfill service. They were calling into it from this open source CDN service that had been the domain of which had been purchased by a threat actor out of China. And so everybody's pointing their websites to this CDN, grabbing polyfill from that, loading it into the browser session for every consumer. Unbeknownst to them, a Chinese threat actor had taken over the domain and had basically inserted malicious code into what had been historically a trusted service. malicious redirects, and evidence that we discovered of key logging and data exfiltration, in a secondary research, to the first disclosure. So I bring that up to say, this is the type of risk that's out there and the threat vector that exists. And, the problem that exists with the fact that 82% of the code is not ours, the fact that we're calling in these open source services, and the fact that no one has any sort of, native control over top of this script, as it's running, on the website. Another example is something called Cosmic Sting. This broke late last year, October 2024. It's actually a critical vulnerability in Magento and Adobe Commerce. If you need it, you hopefully should have patched it by now, but if you need it, CVE 2024-34102 is what you're looking for. I say hopefully you've patched it by now, but I'll get into sort of the patching problem here in a minute. And chances are, if you patched it, maybe you didn't do it right away, but you should. And we're going to talk about, sort of the need to get beyond that sort of like patching framework here, based on changes with AI. But this was 7 different threat groups known to be attacking this vulnerability. 5% of all the sites using Magento and Adobe e-commerce, where malicious JavaScript was added to steal card data, and potentially steal any data being entered anywhere on the website, credentials, login, other forms of, personally identifiable information outside of just card data. It captured up a bunch of big brands, as well as thousands upon thousands of other sites that were using Magento and Adobe Commerce. And another example, of, the type of attack that happens where it's, a wide net, hitting a massive user base, and without native controls and without additional controls applied, has a big impact, on consumers and on brands. All of that has been recognized both by the card associations with Visa and MasterCard and Amex and all the guys chiming in, as well as the PCI Council. That's why they've called for us to take action. Visa has warned as early as 2022, right around the time frame of DSS 4.0, emerging, that this targeting of e-commerce platforms and these third-party code integrations is now sort of like the most common tactic used by threat actors. They've continued to warn against this, in every biannual security report that they put out, but this one sort of crystallizes, sort of like the envisioning of the threat. These threat actors are targeting the supply chain, these third-party service providers. They're going after, the weak link, the area where controls are not being applied, and they're hitting merchants, and all types of organizations really hard. That led to a requirement, under 4.0 or 4.0.1 to do something about this. They refer to it as, eSkimming controls, for PCI compliance. You got to make sure you have an understanding of what the scripts are that are running on your website. You got to have a way to ensure they haven't been compromised, ensure the integrity of them. You got to have, a conscious effort and process, that you go through to the inventory and justify why they need to be there. And then you need to monitor on a weekly basis for any changes, and alert and prevent any exfiltration. So alert and block on malicious scripts, on payment pages. I'll come back and talk a little bit about, those elements as we get deeper into this. I wanted to just also introduce, because there's a couple of healthcare providers on this call, that it's not just about attacks. It's also about, the lack of control over these third parties and what these third parties can do and are doing, that jeopardizes other forms of, data privacy regulation. Just a couple of weeks back, it was released that 4.7 million consumers had their information shared by Blue Cross of California. I'm sorry, Blue Cross Blue Shield of California. A misconfigured Google Analytics deployment led to a bunch of PHI being sniffed by Google. That's a bad thing. It continues to happen. Google, Meta, other services that are running, they're obviously scraping data to be used in, marketing and analytics and things of that nature, but they're scraping data that is privacy protected and is a big no-no and should not be released. And so when you think about this, there's a security threat, there's a data privacy angle, there's a need to control this JavaScript that's running on the website. I won't go too much into this, because I want to get to the meat of the conversation. But the Office of Civil Rights, which manages HIPAA, has specifically gone on record about this problem. And if you're a healthcare company, you should know about that. And, if you're, again, seeking a way to drive the organization forward, you should consider that this is a two bird, one stone type of focus. It's both required under PCI, and it helps support, protection of other forms of that privacy protected data. All right, so let's get into how AI is basically changing things and how it's advancing the capabilities of these e-skimming actors, and how this is sort of like the beginning of what we need to be worried about, but we should be worried about it today, and we are behind the ball. The rise of AI tooling and malware has basically been going on for a couple of years. It's getting better and better. It's getting faster and faster. We're probably a couple of years behind the attackers as a result. And that probably changes in an exponential kind of fashion with every passing day, week, and month. So the gap gets bigger than that 2 years, given the advancements and the capabilities that they have and the constant learning side of things that they can do with this tooling. Underground marketplaces now are offering turnkey GPT-powered fraud kits. And they are doing so in such a way that completely erodes the technical barrier of entry for new threat actors and really, really eradicates the financial barrier of entry as well. On the technical barrier front, the majority of research right now around what AI is doing with malware is that it's found that it's not incredibly productive at the generative side of things. Okay. So, sitting in front of it and just saying, write me malicious code, is not at the point right now of a super level of sophistication. But modifying and tweaking and using AI and, large language models, to enhance, to mutate, to add polymorphism, to make malware better and less detectable is, absolutely something that's possible. And that's where the bad guys are having a field day right now. I no longer have to actually know how to write, the initial code. I can find, a kit that's available in the wild, and I can now use AI to increase its capability, its potency, and reduce the ability of traditional security controls to detect and stop it. The big problem there. On the financial end of things, that's driving down the cost significantly. Individual kits are now, probably less than 1,000 is what we're seeing, in the market. So if I just want one exploit kit, $1,000 or less, to go perpetrate fraud that could, generate me millions. So it's a virtual, non-existent ante-up into the process. That's a reality. We're also seeing monthly subscription, sort of malware as a service, at 10,000 a month or less. This is leading to a real industrial scale, sort of weaponization, if you will, of vulnerabilities. And what we're seeing right now is that, and this is supported by other research, that was disclosed at RSA and, other events, a massive surge in these online fraud communities in terms of the membership. Like Telegram fraud communities now have nearly a million members. So the bad guys are there. They're out there in force. More people are being attracted to it. These barriers are lower. And so the community is surging, of scumbags that want to target your organization. And they've got a couple of year head start on us. They're also starting to use very custom tailored vertical industry attacks as part of their efforts. And so you might see, airlines being targeted specifically for loyalty points. You'll see commerce sites specifically targeted for card data. Every industry loses to fraud as a result, whether they're stealing dollars, stealing identities, or, infiltrating to steal, value out of loyalty systems. The bad guys will go after all of it, and they're doing a good job, and we got to catch up. They're doing such a good job that basically a patch window no longer really exists. You could argue that, patching and, sort of the hygienic aspects of security have always been, 98% of the problem that we need to fix. Unfortunately, we've been arguing that for the entire 30 years that I've been in this industry. It never seems to get any better, and we never seem to do much better in terms of reduction of time, in a patching cycle, from the time a patch is available to the time it's deployed. There's a lot of reasons for why. Obviously, you guys have to look and test, and you have to, make sure, that what you apply as far as a patch doesn't break systems. So there's, a lag there. There's also a lag in knowledge about when vulnerabilities are disclosed. Not everybody's got their ear to the ground and knows every single patch that's released every single day it's released. There are some people that just don't even know that there's a problem. Something like polyfill or cosmic sting. There may be, and there likely are, a lot of people out there who still don't even know that those issues existed, right? Nobody can capture everything, but a lot of reasons why patching has been, underwhelming. But the data says it's generally 32 to 209 days to apply a patch that comes out of the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report for 2024. Sorry. The UK National Cybersecurity Center is basically saying AI is shrinking the exploit to patch window from, I'm sorry, it says path, but it should say patch. The exploit to patch windows from days to hours. Okay. And what does that mean? When a new, exploit or new vulnerability is disclosed and a patch is released, within hours, we have adversaries using that knowledge to their advantage and crafting kits and, targeting sites because they know that this 32 to 209 days is the average. And so, in a lot of cases, these exploits, or I'm sorry, these vulnerabilities aren't even exploited until the announcement from the software vendor is made that the vulnerability exists and that a patch exists, because they know they can rush attacks to market and still catch you, in that window. There's a massive digital divide that the National Cybersecurity Center is calling for. We have to adapt with responsive security controls. You got to have behavioral-based controls at the center of your focus, not just for this eSkimming problem, but writ large in security. Flaws that are exploited within hours of disclosure lead to mass attacks, launch at scale before you can even know or assess whether or not you've been exposed. For one example, you take the cosmic sting that was disclosed in October. As the patch was being worked on, 5 to 30 stores per hour were being infected via automated eSkimmer injections. And so, line speed, industrial size, massive war machine in terms of the adversaries pouncing on top of us. So the patching window for e-commerce stores is now virtually impossible to meet. I mean, you can't do this in hours. You can't do it in, a single handful of days. The median is 32 days, right? From the time that you're told about it, test it, get it in, put it into production, get the green light to put it in production. The patching window no longer exists. And so in eSkimming, you really, really, really must be focused on some other solution outside of hygiene. And I'll talk in a minute about other solutions outside of any that require signature-based detection. 75%, this is a question you should ask yourself if you're on Magento or Adobe Commerce. 75% of stores were still unpatched 1 week after Cosmic Sting. I would still bet that there's a huge portion of sites that have not even applied the patch. Probably in the level 3, level 4, using PCI lexicon, like the smaller merchant kind of world. I bet you there are sites that are still out there, still infected from a disclosure that was made. What would that be? Like 7 months ago, right? Bad stuff happening. Commerce is basically under siege. In 2024, the data said that phishing attacks had jumped 1,265% after ChatGPT was released. Makes a lot of sense. Using generative AI to craft better phishing emails, things that are more believable, look more legitimate, can be used in, sort of the direct attack against your employees or your supply chain for credential harvesting purposes and for access purposes. Massive jump there. There are almost 600,000 AI-driven attacks happening against commerce on a daily basis. As a result, fraud is skyrocketing, and e-commerce is the primary source. There was a 140% increase in e-commerce fraud in 2024. In that same time frame, the last Black Friday, nearly like 35.7% of shoppers were bots or fake users. Rewards point theft is massive. It's skyrocketing. And with every sort of organization out there offering some form of loyalty, everybody's kind of got the problem. I think the number that I've seen most recently is that about 30% of e-commerce attacks are now targeting the rewards aspect of things. The use of malicious ads to inject AI-generated e-skimming is on the rise. And so if you've got ad networks that you employ and that you deploy on your website, that's a primary source of these types of attacks. You should be concerned about. Legitimate services are increasingly being used to mask things, and the increase of the use of AI-driven malware to find new ways to obfuscate itself is something that we've got our finger on and are seeing just as recently as I believe last week was the last blog that we put out that was talking about some of this stuff. So our blog is available on sourcedefense.com. You can stay in touch and keep an eye on things. We've got a fairly robust research focus, and we try and put out as much as we can and disclose as much as we can when we see things. And the polymorphic techniques are being used to evade detection more and more. When I talk about, sort of the need to do something, I always want to try and frame it, not just at the technical level, but help you, frame the conversation at the business level with your organization. There is a real business value of addressing this problem and addressing it now, regardless of the compliance requirements, regardless of the, sort of the stick from PCI that says you must do this, right? There's a business value here, and it relates to fraud prevention, right? There's $32 billion in credit card fraud annually in our systems, right? And that's, a massive problem for all stakeholders on this call. When we think about, the need to protect your organization, it first starts with your brand and your brand reputation. 48% of consumers say that if they get their data stolen, it's your fault as the merchant, even if it's not, even if, there's other partners involved. It was a third party, service provider that you've got plugged into your website that was compromised. They hold you accountable. And roughly 70% say they're going to walk away from you and not do business with you again if you are the source of a breach. And so there's the brand protection side of things that starts at a financial level. How do I make sure my organization is at the source of these things? And then there's the fraud aspect. Again, e-commerce fraud up 140%. 65% of all fraudulent transactions that are occurring right now are coming from that card not present transaction, which means 65% of fraud stems from an upstream theft, of a card not present or an e-commerce transaction, right? And so, we've got to basically make sure that we're looking at this as a way to stop the bleeding systemically, to protect our brands, to protect our consumers, and to protect the bottom line. The cost to merchants behind every $1 of fraud charged is $3.75. So if there's millions upon millions of dollars in fraud, billions of fraud on an annual global basis, it's costing you as the merchant the predominant amount of money, right? And so it all starts with preventing card data from being stolen. That all starts with, eSkimming security protections, because that's where they're stealing the card data that they're using to run the fraud. So, I've got more on that in terms of like the business value and the need to, sort of have that conversation internal. Can happily share any more of those stats that we have. If you want to make this a conversation internally, that's not just technical, but really is about bottom line and risk prevention. I wanted to talk a little bit about one, sort of alarming demonstration of what's possible in AI-generated malware, specifically around the e-skimming side of things. And it is a research paper that was put together, and actually in a project that Palo Alto Networks, put together to see if they could advance their detection capabilities by thinking like an adversary and using AI. And so their Unit 42 research team, well respected, across the industry, put a report out called "Now You See Me, Now You Don't." So it's "Now You See Me, Now You Don't." Palo Alto Unit 42. You should be able to get to the root of it yourself. But basically, they developed an adversary algorithm using large language models to rewrite malicious JavaScript. Okay, and that's one of the sources of that points to the fact that the generative side of things is not as sophisticated as the mutable or what do you want to call it? The morphing or the advancing side of the use of AI, but they use the LLMs to basically rewrite malicious JavaScript and produce thousands upon thousands of fresh variants created in sort of like an ongoing cycle until all detection engines effectively stop flagging them. So, and this wasn't like a long and exhaustive process. This was done at AI speed. And so they were able to basically take existing known malware, have AI rewrite it, have AI test it against detection capabilities, VirusTotal and other forms of detection capabilities that we all access and use, to the point where it was able to produce undetectable, effectively O-day, type attacks, right? It's proof that mutations, are going to make traditional whitelisting and blacklisting approaches completely or utterly useless. And I want to talk a little bit about that before the session ends. What they were able to do and what this allows is the creation of endless skimmer variants at scale and at the push of a button. If they could do it, the bad guys are doing it. Easily use these large language models to rewrite or obfuscate existing malware. It continues to lower that technical barrier. These testing cycles don't take long. Detections stop, and then help create AI-driven polymorphism, which basically makes a dynamic problem even more dynamic. Okay. Summary on kind of like the eSkimming and AI. Supply chain hacks are now going to happen at industrial scale, rapid scale, within minutes of vulnerabilities being disclosed. We're not safe. The malware is becoming increasingly mutable and polymorphic by design. The black market for crimeware as a service is thriving. In a lot of cases, what we're even seeing is bot attacks or bot swarms that actually mask attacks. So you think it's a bot attack, but it's actually, the cover, the smoke screen, if you will, for eSkimming attacks to occur. Patching windows basically are non-existent anymore. You don't have time. And so all of that leads to, why there's this focus on eSkimming security, what the focus needs to be, and then how you guys should be thinking about going at and addressing this problem, right? It's everybody's problem. I wanted to introduce you, real quickly. I won't spend a lot of time on this. Research that we did with Verizon for the 2024 Payment Security Report. We looked at 7,000 of the world's largest website. It's where we got the understanding that 80% of the code is not, first party. We asked, in our research to sort of uncover, how wide scoping the threat surface it is. Across these leading websites, we're looking at like 18 services or 18 partners in that supply chain on average. That's a 50% increase from the first time we did data like that in 2022. And so we're seeing this, propagation and this push forward. And by nature, the services that are deployed without attacks even be there are already doing risky things like transferring data, accessing PII, accessing card data, accessing credentials, maybe for legitimate business purposes, maybe unbeknownst to you for, in the sense of the example of Google Analytics or Meta, need to be controlled, need to lock this surface down. And so there's more research on that we can make available. Scott, maybe you can put the link up for the Verizon PSR report, and we'll have that for anybody who wants it to just, look at the sort of surface of the problem. Obviously PCI says you got to do something about it. They, again, say maintain an inventory, know what's on the site, right? Justify that it needs to be there, assure the integrity of those scripts, confirm that the script hasn't been changed, that the headers have not changed on the site at least every 7 days, and then alert and block on all malicious scripts on payment pages. Now, in the DSS, I think that there are some errors, okay? And I think that the biggest error or maybe, how should I say this? Guidance that has not kept up with this conversation. And, that flies in the face of what we've just discussed. There's a reference to the use of content security policy and sub-resource integrity as potential tools to address the eSkimming problem, okay? So it references that today. I'll talk about some modifications that have been made and some future updates or some updates that have been made subsequent to the publishing of it. It shouldn't. Okay, because everything we just talked about in terms of the way and the capabilities and the advancements that the adversaries are making using AI and the morphing techniques that they're using, and the fact that they can run, through AI and get to, a point where, they've created things that can't be detected, flies completely in the face of, potentially using either of these two services to stop this problem. Dynamic third-party scripts could never be hashed if you ever wanted to, and all third-party scripts, for the most part, are dynamic. So, in other words, the third party is actually changing the JavaScript on the fly. Okay, so even if you wanted to whitelist everything that you were running because of the dynamic nature of JavaScript, you couldn't. Okay, and the bad guys, can use that same advancement, and it was just demonstrated, to ensure that you can't be, sort of like knowing everything that's running. Trusted domains and services are often compromised. We just mentioned the polyfill thing earlier in the session. There's a blog that we put out about how they're now using Google Tag Manager as a masking technique. And I believe, Scott, that's the one, from I think last week, maybe the week before. But if you can find that, great. If not, we can drop it in follow up. Hashes break on every polymorphic mutation. So there goes SRI. And those undetectable payloads are being delivered at speed. So CSP uses a whitelisting capability. SRI uses hashes. If you whitelist a service that's been compromised, you're going to let it run. You let the fox into the hen house. If you are in a situation where you're reliant on hashes and they can just outpace you on that, you're not going to win. Now, there has been subsequent update to the DSS with a task force that was created. We sat on. I was the individual on our end that was actually on it. And with subsequent guidance on the problem, where 80 industry experts from service providers to merchant acquirers to the card brands basically leveled in a unanimous opinion: don't use CSP, don't use SRI. They failed to address the needs of eSkimming, and they alone, even if they could address the issues, can't address all the requirements in 643 and 1161. And so there's a document that you can find on the PCI Security Council's resource section that outlines all of this. But effectively, we're all putting you guys on note saying, don't think you can approach this problem. Those are 1900s era technologies, and we are well advanced of that in terms of what the threat surface looks like. Okay, that was also echoed in a white paper that Viking Cloud did, where they looked and looked at sort of the problem. They looked at our capabilities. They reviewed our product, and they levied some warnings about the complexity of managing CSP, but more specifically about the fact that the static nature of it meant that either you would be over blocking and shutting off services, or that you would completely miss attacks as they occur. So I said I'd try and get to this in about 45 minutes. I'm going to move fast. Some of you on this call probably know about all this hullabaloo that was kicked up, and that's probably why your organization may not have moved as fast and hit that April 1st deadline. All this hullabaloo was kicked up around the self-assessment questionnaire A that happened in January 30th, like literally a month and a half or 2 months before this deadline that everybody had been working towards. It changed a little bit of the scope, but then it's changed back. And so, I'm here to tell you that, you should do this regardless of whether or not you think SAC A makes it such that you aren't required to do something. You should be doing something. The threat's there. I've made the case. The problem is there. It's the source of fraud. You got to do something. But if you've just read the SAC A, right, you might think, oh, well, that de-scoped this thing for me because I'm a SAC A merchant. But it actually changed with 1588, which is an FAQ that was released by the PCI Council to clarify all the problems they created. And so I'll walk you through both of those real quick, and then I'll walk through our 30-day support program and get you there, right? So change scope, but only for SAC A. Effectively, what it said is that 643 and 11.6.1 were no longer required if you were a SAC A merchant, and basically they also then added though a requirement. So they said you don't have to do all the things under 643 and 11.6.1, so long as you can confirm your site is not susceptible to attacks from scripts that could affect the e-commerce systems. right? Which is like really weird because that's what 643 and 11.6.1 were intended to do, is give you a pathway to figure out how to protect your site, from these types of attacks. I think what the intent, or I know what the intent was to minimize, the burden on level 4 merchants for reporting. And so, if anything, it was intended the way they did this to try and reduce scope, but not eliminate focus on eSkimming. I think that's had the opposite result. I think a lot of people put the air brakes on projects and said, no, we got to see what happens and see how this shakes out. Well, it did shake out. It shook out with FAQ 1588. And 1588 was released at the end of February, and it specified what they meant by confirming that your site is not susceptible to attacks from scripts that could affect e-commerce systems. It said you can do so in one or two ways. And here's the drum roll. Ready? Like NMO. Okay, you can use 643 and 11.6.1. Okay, so like, oh my God, like, tiger chasing its own tail. Or you can turn to your PSP, your TPSP, your payment service provider, or a third-party service provider, like your e-commerce platforms, if you use one. And if they can guarantee that they have a solution that, when implemented, protects your page from these script attacks, then you're off the hook. Well, there's not virtually any providers out there that can make that claim. And the only thing that a PSP or a TPSP would control is an embedded iframe that they might give you, or the protection of their redirect page. I want to talk a little bit about like the reality of how these attacks occur. They're not happening isolated down to payment pages. They're happening site wide. They're occurring across the entire site where all of the scripts are running. And we find these things time and time and time again. We've got one from February 20th. We got another one that was just disclosed last week, where effectively what's happening is, the bad guy isn't waiting for the consumer to get to the specific page that checks them out, or that concludes, the transaction. They're just, effectively compromising the site upstream and inserting themselves into, or redirecting, into fake processes that are unbeknownst to the consumer. And so we have one example in February where a compromised script was used, two malicious domains from Mass's legitimate resources. It basically intercepted legitimate form submissions. It created a perfect visual replica of a legitimate payment element. So it basically mimicked in an embedded iframe. It made it look like they were going through the checkout process, and actually used and validated the card to ensure that when they were only stealing active credit cards, by using an API that was in existence with Stripe. So they actually used part of the capabilities in the legitimate checkout process to their own advantage, to make sure that they could check and see what was going on before they stole cards. And it maintained the original purchase flow, so that there was no no consumer flagging it to the impacted websites and saying there's something wrong and broken with your checkout process. In fact, we're doing a webinar, I think, on the 29th with one of our PFI partners, PCI forensic investigators. And they'll echo this quote, in that call. So if you want to come, we'll talk a little bit more about the types of attacks that we're seeing here in a couple of weeks. But this is from Security Metrics. They've done 2,000 forensic investigations involving eSkimming, and in 100% of the cases where eSkimming occurred, it did not happen specifically on the payment page or attacking an embedded iframe. So I mentioned previously that there's some issues with respect to guidance in the DSS, specifically, recommending CSP and SRI as potential approaches. That's been, sort of, I think, debunked as, as good advice. I think that the SAC-A and the 1588 stuff, and even the scope of the DSS currently, doesn't reflect the true nature of what's going on with eSkimming. You should just move on this to protect the brand, protect the consumer, eliminate fraud, and you should be thinking about this thing in a site-wide capacity, not just isolated down to specific pages. And that's where we come into play. We are a behavioral-based solution to this problem. We do not use signatures. We monitor and establish baseline behavior, and then we look for any indicators of compromise with changes in script behavior. And we deploy in two very easy ways. We deploy either externally, not even a deployment if you would want to look at it like that, and we can scan from the outside, scan your web properties, provide all of the data that you would need to be PCI compliant, but we're going to leave it at the monitor and alert sort of end of things. You're going to be responsible for integrating, what we detect into your security operations and for having, a timely response on that. The vast majority of customers do not need more alerts to deal with. We know that. And so that's where we lead primarily with a preventative first approach, which sandboxes all this JavaScript, applies behavioral controls over top of it, monitors and looks for any indication of change in behavior, flags and prevents that behavior from occurring, isolates out, the ability of these third parties, whether legitimately or illegitimately in a compromised fashion, isolates out their ability to actually access sensitive fields, minimizes their ability or actually blocks their ability to change what's going on the website. It does all of that with a couple of lines of code deployed in as fast as 24 hours with less than an hour worth of management on a monthly basis, probably fewer, minutes than even that, at a cost that is virtually non material, to your budget in security or to your budget overall in IT for sure, and pales in comparison, to the business value added for protecting the brand from these, potentially tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars worth of losses, right? So I'm not going to do like a full-blown commercial on like source defense. For the time we have available, I want to take questions if you have them. But I do want to tell you that we have the ability to get you moving and we can guide you through this process. You should do it now. If you're not compliant, you're probably waiting for your next ROC or your AOC, to happen in PCI. We can get you up and down as fast as you'll go. We've had one client, that I have a memory who was suffering a breach. We turned them on overnight. But we can move at your pace, but we've got a plan that puts it together. It says from the first conversation to scoping to, testing, to deployment is 30 days or less. And so we can do that for you. If you're interested, you can drop me a line at steve@sourcedefense.com. You can engage with us through one of the forms on our website. They are protected. We are ensuring that because Source Defense is deployed on our site. Or you can respond to one of our resource personnel who will be reaching out to you with the recording of the session, probably at some point tomorrow. So if there's any questions, I'd love to field them. I've been talking really fast. I need to drink some water and maybe give you time to throw anything that you might have out there. And I'm not going to do any of these like canned question kind of things. If you've got them, they'll be legitimately you asking them. I didn't ask AI to create a laundry list of fake questions for me. So if anybody's got anything from the field, now is the time. Anything? Anyone? Bueller? What is voodoo economics? Voodoo economics. Bueller? Anybody? Okay, I'm not seeing anything. Nobody's raising the hand. Again, Scott dropped a bunch of resources in the chat window. So please avail yourselves of those. Links to our blog, links to some of the white papers that were mentioned. Like I said, we'll have this recording out to you by tomorrow. Let's get moving and help you out here and get this problem off the table. We're a community-minded organization. Hopefully that comes across, and we want to help you. And even if that, just entails getting in and help get your project started by talking to the right people and educating people inside your organization, we're willing to do that. So my email again is steve@sourcedefense.com. Drop me a line with any questions. Appreciate your time. Keep fighting the good fight. And definitely, if you are not, make sure you're evolving your focus to include a bunch of research on what's going on in the world of AI, pretty much on a